Hi, my name's Dave Newton, Principal at Regent's Theological College. The video you're about to watch was taken from our Elim Theological Conference 2021, where we explored the theme of eschatology under the banner Mission Ready. I hope you enjoy it. I hope it challenges you and stirs your thinking. If you want to watch more of these videos, they're available on the Elim Pentecostal YouTube channel. Or if you want to take your theology further, why not check out Regent's Theological College at the website advertised below. Hope you enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Hi, I'm Todd Bolsinger, Executive Director of the Church Leadership Initiative at Fuller Theological Seminary. It is a privilege to be with the Elim Pentecostal Church, and especially for this conference, serving leaders. That's what I do, it's what you do, it's what we do together, and it's what needs to be done for the sake of the church in a changing time. And it's really a privilege to be with you. This is the Mission Ready Leader, Refueled and Resilient. The Mission Ready Leader is a resilient leader, formed in the mission through reflection and relationships. Recently, as I've been traveling around the country, at least up until COVID, I began to recognize that everybody was talking about how fast things were changing. I'd spent the better part of the last 5 years talking about my book, Canoeing in the Mountains, where I was describing the change that was happening to the church in one generation after 1700 years of Christendom. 1700 years of Christianity in the West having a home court advantage that now in one generation was changing. And most of us were completely disoriented by that. Most of us had been trained by institutions that were decades or sometimes centuries old. And they were used to doing things a certain way with certain assumptions about the world. And all of that was changing in one generation. And then March happened, at least March in the United States, because it was about the middle of March that we all became aware that this thing called a pandemic was sweeping the world and was changing everything. And all of a sudden we found ourselves in an unprecedented time. It was 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We were in a worldwide health pandemic. We were in a worldwide global recession, and we were having social unrest and uprisings around the world in protest about social injustice. And most leaders were trying to figure out, what do you do with it? What do you do when the only thing constant about change is that it is speeding up? Brother David, tell me about exhaustion. The two old friends were in a cabin. One of them was David White, a poet. The other one was Brother David Steindl-Rast, a monk. The poet took a deep breath and asked the monk the question, Brother David, tell me about exhaustion. Many of us could ask the same question. We could hear that question being raised, and we lean in a bit. We feel exhausted. We feel exhausted by the circumstances we're in. We feel exhausted by the challenges of ministry. We feel exhausted by the divisions in the life of the church. And we feel exhausted by trying to continually create new, innovative responses to a world that is changing so rapidly we can't keep out. Brother David, tell me about exhaustion. The kindly monk looked at the poet and said, you know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest. What is it then? The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. He goes on to say, you're so tired through and through because a good half of what you do here in this organization has nothing to do with your true powers. You are only half here, and half here will kill you after a while. You need something to which you can give your full powers. You must do something heartfelt, and you must do it soon. What I want to say to you, friends, is the mission-ready leader is a person who leads with their heart, but they do so with a kind of resilience that will enable them to continue to lead even in a rapidly changing world. You need something to which you can give your full powers, because half-hearted after a while will kill you. Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so what I want to do with the rest of my time with you is talk about the way that we can use this very crisis, this very moment we find ourselves in, in the middle of a pandemic, on the edge maybe of a vaccine, in a world that is changing so dramatically and so rapidly that we have absolutely no idea what the next year or even the next month will bring. But in the middle of this crisis, there's an opportunity here for us to become mission ready, refueled, and resilient, ready for the next thing that would come and ready to continue the good work of the gospel. Ronald Heifetz at Harvard University has written a lot about adaptive change. Adaptive change and adaptive leadership is what happens when you find yourself in an unprecedented place, when your best practices and your expertise can no longer serve you at this moment, when you find yourself being asked by the people who are following you, so what should we do? And the only honest answer you can give them is to look them straight in the eye and say, I don't know. I can't predict the future. I don't know what's next. We've never been here before. We're actually in a completely different crisis, and we're going to have to get through it together. When you find yourself in this kind of crisis, Ronald Heifetz says, it's best to think about the crisis as having two distinct stages. Stage one is what he calls the acute stage. It's like when a person has an emergency, like a heart attack or something, and they find themselves wheeled into the emergency room. In the emergency room of a hospital, the staff all gather around. Everything else stops. The family takes a step back, and everybody surrounds the patient to make sure one thing: the patient has to survive, stabilize, protect, buy time. This is what it's been like for many of us going through this crisis of the pandemic. We find ourselves all of a sudden thrown into some place that feels like an emergency. Our organizations are completely upended. Our churches are ground to a halt. We're not sure what to do next. And the very best thing to do is recognize at this moment that we need to gather together, stabilize, protect, buy time. It's what my friend Andy Crouch and his partners at Praxis Labs did when they took on an article and tried to describe how to lead in a time like this. They said that for some folks, it starts with a blizzard mentality. It's like when there's a giant snowstorm outside the house that shuts down all of the roads and all the businesses, and all you can do is hunker down and try to stay safe and wait out the storm. And the acute stage is like that. It's like being in the middle of a blizzard. It's just time to gather together, hunker down, take a deep breath, rest, buy time. What often happens in an emergency room is the patient that's been wheeled in, as soon as they're feeling better, says, I just want to go home. I just want to go back. Let's just get back to the way we were before. The wise leader knows that if we find ourselves in this moment of acute crisis, no matter what put us there, there's actually an opportunity to look at some things and face some things that we might not have looked at or faced before. This is what Ronald Heifetz calls the adaptive stage. It's when the leader uses the urgency of the moment, once we know we're going to survive, to ask the question, what changes can we make so that we can thrive? If we give ourselves wholeheartedly to the way in which God might be transforming us through this, well then, what could we face that we haven't faced before? What could we look at that we haven't looked at before? What might we do that could make us a healthier, stronger, more faithful congregation or organization after the crisis than we were before? The adaptive stage addresses the underlying issues that we've not had the will to confront before the crisis. It's what Andy Crouch and his colleagues called the Ice Age mentality. It's believing that this first crisis is just the beginning of a whole changing environment, and that those who are going to thrive prepare for the long term and the giant change that is happening all over the world in every environment. Instead of just hunkering down and trying to go back to the way it was, they actually thrive by moving through it. Adaptive leadership, Ronald Heifetz says, seizes the opportunity of moments like this to hit the organizational reset button. For many of us as leaders, this moment of crisis comes with a moment where not only are we as leaders in crisis, but our entire congregations or organizations are in crisis. The challenge ahead of us seems so daunting that we can have a failure of nerve. And that failure of nerve, a desire to go back, like the Hebrews who were rescued by God from Pharaoh, found themselves on the edge of the wilderness, having just seen God deliver them through the crossing of the Red Sea and the parting of the Red Sea, now finds themselves with Pharaoh's army washed up on the beach, ready to move into the wilderness to go to the promised land. And 6 weeks later, 6 weeks, they are saying, oh, we should go back. Our tummies are grumbling. We are hungry and tired. This is harder than we thought. You know, they may have killed our children, but at least we had leeks and onions when we were in Egypt. This failure of nerve it happens very, very often in congregations and in organizations. This moment of doubt, this desire to go back to the familiar more than to push forward into the adventure. And the leader has to face this moment and not have her own failure of nerve. The failure of nerve in the leader is when you cave to the pressure of the anxiety of the group to return back to the status quo. It's a loss of courage to further the mission. It's where you go along with the anxiety and say, you're right. We should just stabilize. We should just stay right here. Matter of fact, we should get back to familiar terrain. Let's go back and make sure that everybody is comfortable instead of pushing forward into what God has called us to be. But for other leaders, there's a second kind of failure you have to be careful about. Moses faced it later on in Numbers 11. After months and months of God providing manna every morning, a miracle every day, the Israelites got tired of the miracle. Manna again? Oh, the leeks and onions of Egypt sounded really tasty right then. And they found themselves again grumbling and wanting to go back. This time, instead of asking the Lord to produce a miracle and to provide and sustain for them, Moses goes to God and basically says, if you're going to leave me with these people, well, you can kill me now. Every leader's faced that, haven't you? Every one of us has gotten to the moment where we've thought, if this is the people that I have to serve, if this is the project that you have to give me, if this is my assignment, I'd rather go work for a company. I'd rather go do trail maintenance in the mountains. I'd rather be a barista. Just take me out of this. Take me out now. How do you overcome both a failure of nerve and this failure of heart? Both the caving into the pressure to collude and the discouragement and cynicism that often comes when we're facing difficult times. We do so through resilience. And the mission-ready leader needs to be refueled and resilient. Let me give you one good example. August 28th, 1963. 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in order to protest what had been the long, hard struggle of civil rights in the United States. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, most African Americans in the country weren't experiencing anything close to the freedoms that they expected. Many of them, especially in the South, had to protest over and over and over again. They'd faced hoses and dogs and jails. They protested and they had marched for their rights and they were tired. But when they gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial, hundreds of thousands of them deep, they heard the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King ring out. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Most of us know those words. But what most of us don't know is those words weren't in the original script. He had prepared a presentation that was built on an analogy about the African American citizens of the United States of America not getting the proper promissory note that they had been given in the proclamation of Emancipation Proclamation. That it was like The United States of America had written them a check that had been returned insufficient funds. And because it was time for the United States to make good. And when Dr. King got to that part of the speech where he was to bring it all home, he knew that it didn't have quite the effect that he thought it was going to have. So he paused for just a second, and he heard behind him Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, who said to him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." He slid his notes to the side, and Clarence B. Jones, who was one of his compatriots and friends, said to the person next to him, "These people don't know, but they're about to go to church." And he launches into a vision of Isaiah 40. "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made a plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope." This is the faith that I go back to the South with. Think about that. This vision of a world that will someday be made right, where God will make everything the way it's supposed to be, where all the people will see the glory of the Lord together, and all people will live in justice. This vision gives him faith to go back to the South, to go back to the hoses and the dogs, the marching in the streets and the jails and the dangers. With this faith, I go back to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. I love this image of hewing out of a granite mountain of despair stones of hope, not obliterating with dynamite, not smashing through with a sledgehammer, but chiseling, forming, carving, transforming the mountain of despair into stones where you can build something great. I think of 1 Peter. "Come to him a living stone, and let yourself as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God." With this faith, we'll be able to take this moment of great despair and injustice and transform it into a place where the presence of God is seen, where the glory of the Lord will be revealed, where all flesh shall see it together in our day and in our time. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair stones of hope. We'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. So here's the question. How do we become a tool that can hew hope from despair? I want to say that the mission-ready leader is one who can bring hope in the midst of despair, that can bring transformation where there is nothing but block and resistance and sabotage and discouragement. The work of being transformed into a tool is like the work of a blacksmith on steel. When a piece of steel is taken and put into the forge and into the fire and shaped through working and heating and holding and hammering, through the work of transformation that happens in a leader. And the first thing you need to know as the resilient, mission-ready leader is that the kind of resilience to become a tool that can hew is only formed in the leading. It only happens in the middle of the work. Like the way that you can't transform steel into a chisel by thinking about it or talking about it, but it actually has to go through the work of transformation. The leader has to go through the work of transformation. And this is why it's so profoundly painful. Because the moment before you become a leader, before you take the pulpit or take on a project or have people look to you for direction or discernment, usually the moment right before that is the moment that you are the expert, that you did really well, that you became a trustworthy person in their eyes. And so they asked you now to step in and take on more responsibility. You're the best speaker, so now you should become our pastor. You're the best at sales, so now you should be the sales manager. You're the best at organizing projects, so now you should be the project lead. And you realize there's a giant gap between being the expert who takes on the responsibility for a task and the leader who leads a team. And that process of leading a group of people through their own resistance, like the Israelites in the wilderness, through their own fears and anxieties, and through their own need for transformation, is the great challenge for the mission-ready leader. But it only happens when you step into the responsibility and while you're doing the work of leading. What we learn from Ronald Heifetz is that you move from surviving to thriving in a crisis by thinking about using both stages. You're thrust into leadership. You're now in a crisis. In the acute stage, you and the organization need to care for each other. We survive the acute stage mostly through wise relational support. The depth of our relationships, the way we trust each other, the connection we have for each other, that's what helps us stabilize and get through the crisis. But then once we've calmed down just enough to know that we're going to survive this crisis, we have to enter into the adaptive stage. And that adaptive stage is where the leader develops the capacity to learn, to face losses, and to get at the underlying issues, the big challenges, the things that are keeping us from becoming the congregation or the organization that God has called us to be in order to accomplish our mission. So let me ask you to consider this. What are the underlying conditions being revealed in the church today? Think about this. If you're at all familiar with what it's been like in the pandemic, you know that COVID as a disease attacks human bodies that have underlying conditions. That makes us more vulnerable. Some get through the disease relatively quickly and well. Praise be to God, there's a high survival rate. But others have a deep sense of danger. If you have any of those conditions, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, pretty soon you find yourself in a particularly dangerous position. And this is the way that it is for many churches and organizations. The pandemic didn't cause a problem. It revealed the underlying issues that were there all along. What are some of them? Think about that for your own context. During 2020, I probably did almost 100 of these presentations. And what I found was when I asked this question to people in context where they could feed back to me, there were certain themes that came out over and over and over again. Underlying conditions that the pandemic and the crisis of 2020 has brought to the surface. Underlying conditions like a lack of deep discipleship for a persevering church, a lack of deep community that keeps people connected and unified in times of disconnection and division, a lack of extensive leadership capacity that we're going to need if we're going to have more distributed models of ministry. And the fact that the church has been so shaped within the dominant Western culture that it is unable to speak prophetically, collaborate for justice, or serve the common good. These underlying conditions were there before the pandemic, but now they become apparent. And the mission-ready leader, resilient, ready to become a transformational leader, to be a tool that can hew hope from despair and transformation from discord, looks to these underlying conditions and gives ourselves wholeheartedly to these tasks, not just surviving, but thriving, not just going back, but going forward and becoming the church that we are meant to be. The resilient mission-ready leader must regularly refuel. And over again, what is proved in research and in personal experience is that refueling comes through relationships. Leaders are formed in the leading, but that experience is so vulnerable that what leaders need more than anything to be able to continue to take their people through the transformation is to be held like an anvil holds the hot steel. When you put a piece of steel into the forge, you've got to heat it until it's almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You've got to get it to the place where that steel becomes almost liquid in order for it to be shaped and transformed. That experience of vulnerability that has happened so often in leadership is actually the place where God can use to shape you if you are well held and well taken care of if you are secure enough in yourself to be able to lead others through the same process. It's like taking that steel and putting it on an anvil that holds it securely. Because vulnerable leadership requires relational security. My wife and I took a blacksmithing class. And when they told us to take the steel out of the forge, I'll never forget the instructor saying, look, it's dangerous when it's this hot. Leaders can get dangerous when they are this vulnerable. It can become difficult to lead right into the face of discouragement or disorientation, or even resistance from our own people. Our egos take a hit. We feel the failure of nerve in our people, and it leads to a failure of heart and cynicism in ourselves. And so we know at those moments that feel particularly vulnerable, when you're trying to lead people into the unknown, when you're trying to tell them to trust God when we don't know the next thing, that at that moment of deep vulnerability, it's feeling like we are like steel that has been heated to the place where it's oozy. This is the place that God can form us and shape us if we allow ourselves to be refueled and made resilient through relationships. Our instructor told us to take the steel out of the forge and put it on the anvil. He said, don't carry it around. Don't try to think you can shape it in midair. If you hit it with a hammer now, it will explode. Instead, it needs to be put on an anvil, held securely. The only safe place for something this hot is on an anvil. Throughout the country and into other countries that I've traveled, and I've talked about the kind of leadership needed like this. This is where I say, more than anything else, my biggest fear is that leaders will try to lead alone. If you're trying to lead a people, even if you're the key leader, know that you need partners, mentors, and friends. You need people who will share the mission with you, partners. They care as much about the mission as they do about you, because they're in this with you because they are called to the same vision of being part of God's work to transform the world through your particular congregation or organization. You need partners. You also need mentors. You need coaches and spiritual directors and counselors and mentors. You need people you can step back and ask questions and get advice and get care. You need people who care about you and the mission. That's what mentors are. Your partners care about the mission more than they care about you. Your mentors care about the mission and you. And you need friends. You need people who care more about you than they care about whether you're successful at the mission. You need people who look at you and care for you and want to make sure you're doing okay too. You need all three. All three relationships make up a heavy, thick anvil. Take a moment and consider, what are the state of relationships in your own life as you seek to be a mission-ready leader? Do you have enough partners, or are you trying to do it alone? Do you have any mentors? Many of us, especially the more we move into leadership, start believing that we're supposed to have all the answers, to be the expert, to be an adaptive leader who continues to learn and takes people through the difficult pain of loss and transformation, requires that we have people who we can always go to for advice: spiritual directors, therapists, counselors, mentors, coaches. And do you have friends? Do you have people who care more about you? Do you have people who check in on you, remind you to take care of yourself, to exercise and to eat and to have some play on occasion, who invite you to take a deep breath, a long walk, a good meal, or just check in to make sure you're okay? Because when push comes to shove, they're really here for you. The only safe place for the vulnerability and heat of leadership is if you've got a heavy anvil. Resilient, mission-ready leaders must be also grounded in something other than the success of the mission, which means you also need, as part of your anvil, perhaps the biggest part, a deep sense of relationship with God. relationship with God that grounds you before you have done anything. Jesus had it. Jesus was grounded in the love of God before he had done anything. Before he preached a single sermon, before he healed a single person, before he confronted a single power, before he had taken on a single opposing camp. Before he proclaimed the kingdom of God, the first thing he did was submitted himself to baptism and heard the words spoken over him. At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit, looking like a dove, come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice, "You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." Dear friends, the mission-ready leader is someone who refuels constantly and develops resilience continually because they know deep in their heart they are grounded in something much bigger than the very task that is to change the world. They are grounded in the love of God, who loves us and chooses us and marks us before we've done anything. You must be grounded in something other than your success as a leader. It's the only way that you will ultimately have the confidence to continue on. So more than anything, what I wish for you as mission-ready leaders is that you will be refueled and resilient because you know that you are held in the deep relationship with God. You are chosen, marked by God's love. You are the pride of God's life.
So Todd, thank you so much for taking the time to unpack some really, really insightful information for us as we think about this whole subject of becoming missional leaders in changing times. And I just want to say on behalf of our movement, many of our leaders have really appreciated and engaged with your book, Canoeing in the Mountains. And it certainly spoke into us thinking about this theme of adaptive leadership, even well before this pandemic hit and caused us to kind of consider it on a whole new level. So as we think about being an adaptive leader and what's required, you talk about the need to do it when our best practices and expertise can no longer serve us in this movement. And I think one of your quotes was, great adaptive leaders use the urgency of the moment so that we can face up to what we need to do in order to thrive. This is my question, Todd. How do we train leaders to be ready with adaptive qualities? You know, it's one thing to training leaders for the long haul, but to be responsive and adaptive. And secondly, how do we train ourselves to be adaptive leaders?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is that adaptive leadership is more formed than trained. It's more about who you are as a leader than it is about any techniques. I mean, so most of us, when we become a leader, the moment after we were an expert at something else that was not leading, right? So you're the best preacher, the best speaker, you become the pastor, you're the best scholar, you become the head of the school, right? You are an expert at something, and then they say, would you like to be in charge? We think God's called you to be the leader. And at that very moment, you are now a beginner all over again. And so at that moment is really when you need to have the humility to lead through learning. And that means standing in front of your people and saying, I don't have all the answers, but I believe that God has called us together for us to learn together about how we can be more faithful to the mission that God has given us. And that's a character quality that starts more in humility and empathy than it is in some kind of expertise. And that's the real challenge. Most of us think that the best leaders are the experts, and really, the best leaders are the best learners.
Yeah, really interesting, because probably not a characteristic we would associate naturally with the leader, that kind of the humble place, the learning place, as opposed to that seat of expertise. And I was particularly struck, it was a tiny throwaway line in the middle of your talk where you talked about uncovering and exposing some of the underlying conditions within our churches and organizations, and you listed 4, and I was intrigued. I wanted to know more. You know, you talked about a lack of deep discipleship. You talked about real community or extensive leadership capacity, or unity that doesn't give the church a prophetic voice. Could you grab one of those and just expand on one of those for us, and let us just think a little bit more about one of those underlying conditions of the church?
Yeah, so one of the things that has been really helpful for me is to think that this pandemic has been apocalyptic, to use our Christian phrases, right? It means it's been revealing. It has revealed a lot of things, and it has revealed a lot of things that were already here. So when I spend time working with leaders across the country and across the world sometimes, what I find oftentimes is I'll ask them, what have you noticed about your congregation or about your movement that you knew was there ahead of time, but it's just been writ large because of the intensity of this moment? And the very first thing that almost everybody says is, we were not discipled as deeply as we thought we were. Okay. We have relied too much on large gatherings and techniques and crowds and enthusiasm and well-intended activities, but we need the depth of character formation that takes on the qualities of Jesus. And I think about this a lot. This morning, I was listening to the Beatitudes again, and literally, the meek will inherit the earth. I thought, where do we get training in meekness in a world like we're in today? If the church doesn't do it, it's not going to get done. And yet, wouldn't exactly say, especially in the United States at the moment, that we have a very meek church. And that's really important for us to realize, the deep training of walking with Jesus and taking on the qualities of Jesus so that we might be able to fulfill the mission of God in the world is going to be required of us much more in a changing world. And that means this opportunity that the pandemic and other crises give us is to see that and then decide to put our attention toward that.
Yeah. So you talk about deep discipleship. I'm sure you're not talking there just about more information, more Bible teaching, more groups. That character quality formation, is essential.
Yes. So one of the ways that I talk about this, so like in my most recent book, which is a book about how you develop resilience for facing resistance, and especially resistance from your own people. So like to be like Moses, who had to face the fact that the very people that he had just freed from Egypt were all saying, oh, why don't we go back? Yeah. Like, they might have killed our children, but at least we had leeks and onions for lunch. He had to like give them courage. He had to push them on. He had to help them see the presence of God. The kind of discipleship that we're talking about really requires a set of spiritual practices that will shape us. So one of the ways I talk about this, Dave, is when I became a Christian, they told me, hey, read your Bible every day, pray every day, go to church every week. Well, those were really important. That helped me grow as a Christian. When I became a pastor, I couldn't just read my Bible a bit every day. I had to do hours of deep theological study, deep biblical study, prayerful study about my people and about what God wanted. It deepened me in the Word. Well, now I serve a leadership center. Like I've gone from being a preacher and a pastor to a seminary administrator, and now I'm a professor. So what are the spiritual practices I need today to fulfill my calling? They might be different even than when I was preaching to the same congregation every week for 17 years. But they still require the scriptures, they require prayer. They just require a different focus of spiritual practices, and in some ways, some different spiritual practices than I used to have at different times in my life.
Yeah, so not just adapting to the situations we find ourselves in, but adapting to our own roles and the people we find around us. Well, one of the things that really fascinated me in your talk was this idea of the barriers to our leadership development. So you talked about adaptive leaders identify the need to change. So we all know something needs to happen, but there were two things that maybe caused us to go back. The first one was a loss of courage. We haven't got the confidence and the boldness to kind of to push through. And the second one was a loss of heart. We just kind of tired, weary. And this quote really resonated with me. As weary, disorientated leaders, we need to find hope to refuel us and keep us going. The first question, how do you do that, Todd? Secondly, how do we do that?
Yeah. So part of what I'm referring to here is Edwin Friedman wrote a book called Failure of Nerve. And what he really said was the big challenge for most leaders isn't having a vision about what you want to do in the world. It's that as soon as you are at all successful getting people rallied together toward your vision, as soon as the resistance hits, the obstacles hit, they're going to want to go back.
Yeah.
So just always remember, the root word for family and familiar are the same root word. And I always say that when people find themselves in unfamiliar territory, they feel like they are orphans, like they're homeless, like they've lost their family. And so what they want is they want to run home to what's familiar, even if that, in the case of the Israelites, was slavery, right? They'll want to go back. So leaders have to have overcome the failure of nerve and push forward. But very often, doing that after a while, you just get tired. And then you end up with this, what I call a failure of heart. It's what we see with Moses in Numbers 11, when he literally says, oh, kill me now. Like, just if you're going to keep me with these people, kill me now. And I think many of us as leaders have had a moment where we thought, you know what, I could sell cars for a living. That would be simple. Or I always think I could do trail maintenance out in the woods, like in the national parks or something. What does it take to stay focused on our vision? And for me, the first thing it takes is actually honest reflection and acknowledgement that those failures are coming. Yeah. I need to come before the Lord and say, I'm losing my courage. I need you, oh God. Or I'm becoming cynical. I don't like what's happening. These people whom I love, I'm now beginning to grow tired. I need you, God. So there needs to be vulnerable, honest vulnerability. And the second thing, and I would say this is the thing I say almost everywhere I go, is you can't do it alone. You need relationships. You need thick relationships. You need partners. You need mentors. You need friends. You need all three. You need people who care about the mission. I need people who care about me. I need people who say, hey, Todd, I heard you got a new book out. And I go, yes, you want to read it? And they go, no, no, actually, I'm happy for you. I need people who care about the mission. I need people who care about me. And then I need mentors who help me be everything I can be for the sake of God's mission. Coaches, spiritual directors, therapists.
I picked that up in towards the end of your talk. You talked about you needing a host of relationships. I love that phrase, because often we refer to, my mentor or my spiritual director or my friend, but this kind of gave me the picture of the heavenly host announcing the birth of Jesus. There's an army cheering us on in this mission that we've been called to. You said this, the more daunting the task, the stronger the relationships would be. What prevents us as leaders from surrounding ourselves with that host? Why are we still lonely, and why are we still vulnerable in some of these areas if we know that's one of the keys to success?
Well, it goes right back to the thing we started with. We think we're supposed to be the expert. Right? I always say every single person who comes to a seminary, which is where I teach, someone said to them, you're one of the best Christians I know. You should go pro. You should become a professional. You're ready for the Premier League. Like so go get trained. And then when they finish, they have a Master of Divinity. It sounds like a superhero, for crying out loud. And then you go into your congregation and people look at you and say, okay, Pastor, you have all the answers. And every step along the way, you have to do what I call it, is overcome the expert expectation. You need to remind people that to be a disciple is to be a learner. That's what disciple means. It means to be a learner. And that you're going to lead a group of disciples in ongoing learning, which means we need to be together as a community of discipleship, learning together, being formed together, being faithful to our mission together. And that's what leadership requires. And it's very hard when we have the expectation that somehow we're supposed to be the expert leader who has all the answers. That's the problem.
Todd, it'd be great to talk for lots longer, but I know one way we can draw and gain insight from your work is some of your books and resources, of which there are many. Can you point to the direction of some of your maybe recent books and how we can get hold of them and ways we can kind of draw on some of your other teaching?
Yes, the most recent book I have is a book called Tempered Resilience, which is a book about how leaders are formed in the crucible of change. It's really developing the wise resilience to face resistance, and it's the most recent one. And then most of my work is at our Dupree Center for Leadership, the Church Leadership Initiative at the Dupree Center, which is dupree.org/church. Anybody who comes and just looks that up can find a bunch of my resources on what we're doing and what our team is doing, and we can connect you to all kinds of things.
That's brilliant. Todd, I hope at some point we might be able to meet in person.
I'd
I
love to.
even wonder at some point whether there'd be an opportunity for you to come over this side of the water and help us with, as a movement, with some of our leadership thinking and moving forward. But on behalf of the Elim movement, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your input. Thank you for the work you've done in the secret place that has helped us draw on some of your wise and insightful teaching. We really, really appreciate you and all that you've been able to bring. Thank you so much.